Welcome to Lecture 6 of Rehabilitation Theory and Counseling 2. Just as a review, we are reviewing the various stages of the counseling process. We started reviewing the counseling process by talking about Stage 1, which has a focus of establishing the working relationship. We also addressed Stage 2, which focuses on assessing or defining the presenting problem. Stage 3 focuses on identifying and setting goals. And Stage 4 is specific to choosing and initiating interventions. Our previous lecture, which was Lecture 5, we began discussing various interventions that focus on the counseling process. And the first intervention that we discussed in Lecture 6 was focused on affective interventions. There are affective interventions, cognitive behavioral interventions, and systemic interventions. With the previous lecture that focused on affective interventions, we discussed interventions with a focus on feelings or affect, and we discussed the various ways in which we would address feelings and affect within the theoretical frameworks and within different interventions. For this lecture, our focus is on cognitive and behavioral interventions. We have combined both cognitive and behavioral interventions because sometimes it's difficult to talk about one without the other because it's very interrelated and there's a lot of overlap. And oftentimes interventionists are both cognitive and behavioral in its approach, because one thing we don't want to do is change one's cognitions or the way in which a person thinks without changing their behavior, which is usually the ultimate goal. So just as a review of the various interventions, they focus on affect or feelings, cognitions or the way in which a person thinks, and behavioral, the way in which we behave. And lastly, systemic, because that focuses on the systems that we are connected with. We don't live within a vacuum. We function within families, within communities, within systems. And so the third intervention area has to do with a systemic approach to therapy, and we will discuss that in lecture number 7. So what are our objectives for this lecture, Lecture 6? Well, our class objectives are to understand the goals of cognitive intervention. We also want to discuss cognitive intervention skills that are most relevant. We want to identify theories that stress the importance of behavior. We want to explore goals of behavioral intervention, and we will conclude with behavioral intervention skills. So when we say cognitive interventions, let's elaborate on exactly what we are speaking about. Cognitive interventions examine the ways in which clients think themselves into problems, and it also describes interventions that the counselor can use to reverse the situation. Research specific to cognitive interventions says that it's not so much the situation or the antecedent that causes the behavior. It is oftentimes the way in which a person thinks that leads to the problem behavior. And so cognitive intervention takes into consideration the myriad ways in which a client think themselves into problem situations. Cognitive interventions also address mistaken beliefs, attitudes, or patterns of thinking, and give the client the tools to change to more productive and accurate thoughts. Oftentimes, the way in which a person thinks may be specific to their own reality, and it may not be rooted in factual information. And there are times in which people think about things in ways that are inaccurate. They may have attitudes, they may have beliefs, they may have ways of thinking that are erroneous. And so cognitive interventions will provide the necessary skills and tools to clinicians to help the client to understand their beliefs, see the difference between the subjective and objective realities, focus on attitudes that lead to these mistaken beliefs, and also patterns of thinking. Oftentimes, and we'll talk a little bit more about this, we have schemas that we have formed through our personal experiences and our life experiences. And usually when things happen, we put it in a particular category. We arrive at a particular way of thinking about things, and it's based upon patterns of thinking or schemas that we've created. And some of these patterns or schemas that we have are as a direct result of childhood experiences. It may be repeated adult or adolescent experiences, but there are times in which these patterns of thinking are in error or erroneous. And so cognitive interventions, again, assist clients in identifying mistaken beliefs, attitudes, or patterns of thinking, and it provides the client with the necessary tools to change their thinking to more productive and accurate thoughts. So now that we have a clear understanding of what exactly cognitive interventions are and what they focus on, let's take a couple of minutes to explore what cognitions are. Cognitions include people's thoughts, beliefs, and attitudes, not only toward themselves but toward others. It also involves their perception of the world around them. So just taking a step back and reflecting on cognitions and what exactly it is and what it entails. Our cognitions, each of us have cognitions. We have a worldview. We have thoughts, perceptions, and beliefs about the world. Sometimes the thoughts, perceptions, and beliefs that we hold are accurate, and there are other times when they are inaccurate. And sometimes we formulate perceptions and attitudes about situations that are not rooted in fact. It's rooted in cognitions or schemas that we create. And a skilled clinician with a cognitive focus will assist the client to look at their errors in thinking, which are sometimes called faulty thinking, which are especially likely to produce distressing emotions and or problematic behavior. Cognitive therapists work with clients from the perspective that it's not so much the situations that have happened to us. It's not being the fact that we were abused as a child, or the fact that we had an argument with our spouse, or that we are now divorced, or that we currently have an acute disability. It's not those issues that are the problem as per cognitive therapist. The problem is rooted in the way in which we think about and understand those experiences. And if you think about it, there are some individuals that might go through a traumatic experience. For example, they might have a traumatic injury. And you might see individuals that are able to come to grips and acceptance with situations far sooner than others. They might arrive at a place where they have come to terms with issues and they're able to live a full, healthy lifestyle, irrespective of what has happened. And then you might also see another person that becomes extremely depressed, withdrawn, and at times even contemplate suicide because of similar experiences that have occurred for them. And so the point of cognitive interventions or cognitive therapy is that it's not so much the situation that has occurred, but it's the way in which we think about these situations, the way in which we make sense of them, the way in which we internalize them and give them meaning. And so cognitions relate to errors in thinking. And sometimes the way in which we think or the way in which our client thinks is faulty. And our goal as clinicians is to help the client come to a healthy understanding and acceptance of situations that have occurred. And so in a nutshell, that is what cognitions are, and that's the way in which a cognitive therapist functions. There are primary goals of cognitive interventions, and the overall aim of cognitive therapy or cognitive intervention is to reduce emotional distress and corresponding maladaptive behavior patterns by altering or correcting errors in thought, perceptions, and beliefs. And let's just take a minute to unpack this concept and have a better understanding of it. We said briefly that cognitions focus on the way in which a person thinks. And let's take, for example, a person that might come in for treatment, for rehabilitation services as a result of having an automobile accident. And as a result of the automobile accident, they have experienced spinal cord injury. And due to the spinal cord injury, they're a paraplegic. Now, the fact that the person is paraplegic is a life-altering situation. We know that for all of us to go from a mobile, to be able to ambulate with our limbs, and then to get to a place as a result of an injury that we're no longer able to ambulate is a major adjustment, and it is a traumatic, life-altering experience. But it's the way in which we cope with the situation that determines the long-term implications. And so let's take, for example, an individual that might have a more negative or limited cognitive structure in the way in which they adjust. So for that individual that might be paraplegic as a result of an automobile accident, and they have negative cognitions or coping strategies, they may become depressed, they may become withdrawn, they may isolate themselves, see themselves as worthless, minimize their interactions and networks. They may contemplate suicide. For others, they may, once they come to terms with what has happened, they've gone through the various stages of grief, they come to an appreciation for living life. They see alternatives beyond their functional limitations. They're able to embrace life with the disability, taking into consideration that they're still functioning, are able to function in society, they're able to work, they're able to have meaningful relationships, they're able to be members of society that have something to offer. So when you take into consideration the two different cognitions that might present, there's the one with the more negative, limiting cognitions, and then on the other hand, there are also individuals that possess more positive, future-centered thinking with regard to what they're able to do in spite of or despite having an injury or a disability. The other thing to take into consideration when we focus on persons with disabilities and issues related to cognitive adjustment, all persons go through the stages of adjustment. We know that Kubler-Ross talks about the various stages of adjustment, and it starts with sometimes denial, anger, bargaining, acceptance, and adjustment. And so once a person has gone through the various stages, the expectation is that they will come to a place of acceptance. But we also realize that there are some people that become stymied, or they may stay stuck in more unhealthy stages of adjustment rather than matriculating to a place of acceptance. So the goal of cognitive intervention is to focus on the overall aim of cognitions as it relates to reducing emotional distress and corresponding maladaptive behavior patterns by altering or correcting errors in thought, perceptions, and beliefs. Along with cognitive intervention, the cognitive intervention approach is specific skills that are very essential in working with persons that come in for services. So let's delve a little deeper into cognitive intervention skills. These are skills that are cognitive in approach, which, as we said before, cognitive in approach means that it focuses on thinking the way in which an individual thinks, understanding, having a better understanding of their faulty thinking, of the schemas or the ideas or perceptions that a person hold, understanding whether their perceptions are rooted in objective information, whether it's factual or whether it's just based upon the way in which they arrive at an assumption or arrive at meaning. And so the cognitive approaches are designed to recognize and help clients to recognize thought patterns so that they can assess the relationships between themselves and their thinking and the problem. Because as we stated already, it's not so much the situation or the antecedent, but it's more the way in which the client thinks about or conceptualize issues that cause the problem. So there are 16 skills of cognitive intervention that I'd like for us to discuss in greater detail. But just to review them, what I'd like for us to do is to review all 16. I'll say briefly what they are, and then I'll spend a little additional time going over them in more detail. So among the 16 skills of cognitive intervention are eliciting thoughts, modifying thoughts, problem solving, information giving, decision making, cognitive interventions, disputation, decibels and countering interventions, redecision work, cognitive restructuring, thought stopping, positive self-talking, anchoring, reframing, symptom prescription, and resisting therapeutic change. So what do we mean when we talk about eliciting thoughts? Well, eliciting thoughts involves helping the client to differentiate between thoughts and feelings, and to express opinions, beliefs, and self-rules as they relate to their experiences. So just to take a minute to unpack that a little bit, we talked about the fact that clients have a subjective view of circumstances or situations. And sometimes their subjective view of the situation or circumstances are not rooted in fact. And so the alternative to their subjective perception has to do with their objective reality. And we talked about that briefly in our previous lecture. And so in working with our clients in terms of focusing on their cognitions or the way in which they think. We want to help the client to differentiate between their thoughts and feelings and reality. So we want to get them to tell us what they're thinking. What are you thinking? Where does that thought come from? Who told you that life isn't worth living because you have a disability? Where does that come from? Understanding the impetus behind some of the thoughts that a client might have. And so first and foremost, what we'd like to do in working with clients and focusing on their cognitions is eliciting their thoughts. We want to understand what their thinking is, what their beliefs are, and we want to understand what their opinions are about whatever the circumstances or situations are that bring them in for therapy. The second important skill associated with cognitive intervention is modifying thoughts. Once we have a clear understanding of what the thinking is, what their beliefs are, what it's rooted in, the focus oftentimes is on modifying thoughts. And as clinicians, when we work on modifying the thoughts of our clients, it has to do with helping the client to change their thought patterns, especially when it is deemed that it's inappropriate. And so what do you do in order to help a client to modify their thoughts? One of the ways in which you do this is to help the client differentiate between their thoughts and reality. And so let's say, for example, you have a client who comes in and the client might say, I'm having problems at work. I'm not getting along with any of my coworkers. And so you will help the client to identify what are some of the thoughts they have associated with this situation. So the client might say to you, well, nobody likes me. Everyone thinks I'm a horrible person. Whenever I try and communicate with others, they all shun me, they ignore me, they make fun of me behind my back, they talk about me. I think they wish that I weren't there, they wish that I was fired. And so, first of all, you want to understand whether someone has communicated this to the client, because oftentimes the clients and persons in general, they have these thoughts or beliefs or opinions, and when you delve deeper to elicit more information, you find out that no one has ever said that to them. It's just based upon their perception, and as we know, perceptions can be inaccurate. Once you have helped the client to understand that you want to help them to understand their thinking, then, and also the fact that they didn't receive this information from the coworkers, it's that individual that's arriving at their own perception. And so then you help the client to modify their thoughts. And so as the clinician, what I would say to the client is, so tell me exactly what you believe as it relates to your coworkers. And so the client was, let's say, for example, the client says that they hate me. And so as the clinician, I would say to the client, has anyone ever said to you that they hate you? And the client might say, no, they never said it. It's just the way in which they behave. And so I would come to an understanding of the way in which the clients, their coworkers, are behaving, and try and get some real specific information. And that's the more objective part, or the rational part, is to receive more objective information that speaks to the client's cognitions. And so I would say, tell me specifically what they've done that would force you to believe that they hate you. And so let's say the client says, well, nobody talks to me. When I try and talk to them, nobody talks with me. Everybody ignores me. So from that point, I would try and understand what is happening at the point that you are trying to communicate with your coworkers and they're not responding the way in which you would like them to. It might be that the client is trying to engage in conversation when everybody else is trying to get work done. Or it might be the way in which the client initiates conversation is inappropriate or ineffective in having the positive outcome that he or she might want. And so once I understand that there are issues, maybe in the way in which the client is approaching their coworkers, and trying to formulate relations and having conversations, then I would evolve into problem solving, which is your number 3. And your problem solving techniques involve helping the client to identify how he or she might solve problems. Perhaps the client might consider asking the coworkers why there is difficulty in communicating, or if there is a problem, or looking at ways of resolving the problem. Problem solving also involves evaluating those processes associated with problem solving, helping the client explore various ways of resolving the issue or concern, as well as developing more effective problem solving strategies. So you might say to the client, tell me some of the things that you've done already to enhance or overcome some of the barriers that you believe exist between you and your coworkers. And then understanding from an objective clinical perspective ways in which the client has been in error, ways in which the behavior may have been misperceived, and also assisting the client in finding more pro-social ways of having conversations and interacting with the coworkers and achieving the desired outcome that they are hoping for. An additional cognitive intervention skill focuses on information giving. One of the things we realize in the therapeutic process is that the client is giving us a wealth of information, and it is our responsibility to conceptualize, synthesize, and make sense of the information that the client is giving. We realize that there are times in the therapeutic process that we have to provide the client with information, and sometimes the information that we provide goes against the information or the thought processes that the client has. And I say thought processes because when focused on cognitions, which deals with thinking, it oftentimes is rooted in the client's thought processes. So as it relates to information giving, we're wanting to determine what information the client requires in order to make sound decisions and helping the client to obtain the information or outcome that they desire. And so we receive the information, we conceptualize it, we make sense of it, we understand, we try based upon the information that's been conveyed to us to understand what the problems are, and then as clinicians we provide information to the client to help them overcome issues, limitations, or barriers. Number 5 is decision making. With decision making, it's important that we help the client to develop sound decision-making practices. One of the things that we have to realize is that the reason the client is coming to us is because they have tried various strategies or techniques and they were ineffective. And so when the client comes to us, it's because they are needing information, assistance with problem solving, understanding and identifying cognitions and beliefs in ways that they could not have arrived at that information on their own. And so as clinicians, our goal is to help the client make more effective decisions, and oftentimes it's rooted in information giving and problem solving. But again, decision making involves helping the client to develop sound decision making practices. And one of the ways we do this is to assist the client in trying on different kinds of behavior. So once the client has these cognitions, you say to the client, well, what if you were to try doing something different? And the doing something different is the behavioral part of cognitions. Because as we know, we could think that we can, all day long, we can help the client to rethink things or to arrive at different thought processes. But we have to go beyond the thinking to the behaving. And that's where we go from the cognitive to the behavioral. But what we want to do is just stick with the cognitive for a little bit longer before we go into the behavior. But what I wanted to do is give you an understanding of how the client evolves from the cognitive decision making to actually behavior, because ultimately we want to change our interactions, and our interactions or outcomes are associated with behavior. So number 6 also talks about cognitive interventions. And so just to back up a little bit, what we talked about already is the cognitive skills. There are specific cognitive skills that are really important in working with our consumers. And those are eliciting thoughts, modifying thoughts, focusing on problem solving, information giving, and decision making. From understanding this cognitive skills that are really important, we want to go into cognitive interventions. And when we focus on cognitive interventions, there are a number of important issues or factors that we must take into consideration. The first is to really help the client to understand the ABCD analysis associated with their cognitive thinking and analysis. And when you think about the ABCD analysis, that goes to Rational Emotive Behavior Therapy by Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis identified the ABC of cognitions and behaviors, and then years later it was expanded to D and E as it relates to behavior. And so first and foremost, when you look at the ABCD analysis, the first is the antecedent. And the antecedent is always what preceded a person thinking or arriving at the assumptions that they have. So the antecedent may be where the client attempts to communicate with his coworkers. So that's the antecedent or the situation that has occurred. The client having these interactions. And when the client has the interactions, the client perceives that he's not being well received. So from the client's interactions, he arrives at certain beliefs, and those beliefs are rooted in the fact that the client is now thinking that the coworkers don't like him. And because the client believes that the coworkers don't like him, then he behaves differently, and that's the consequence of the cognitions. He behaves differently. Part of the behavior is he doesn't look forward to going to work. He has negative energy when he's in the work setting. He doesn't relate well with his co-workers. He is intentionally doing things because, after all, he perceives that they don't like him. And so in understanding the antecedent or the situation, you want to go through an analysis. You want to understand the antecedent, the beliefs, or the cognitions. You want to understand how it what the outcome is. And then the D part is when our clients come into us for services, because when the client comes into services, we want to make sure that they have a clear understanding of what the realities are. You want to make sure that they understand what the issues are, not just from a subjective perspective, but also from an objective perspective. So help them to understand some of the realities, some of the objective realities. And then from there, we want to assist the client in changing their behavior. And that's the outcome. A change in behavior that brings about more positive outcomes. In getting to that end, sometimes we have to focus on disputation. And so what is disputation? Disputions are challenges that helps the client to understand how their thoughts or behavior processes are causing the problem that they're experiencing. So we want to help the client by challenging the client's thoughts and behavior. And in challenging their thoughts and behavior, we're assisting them to confront their faulty assumptions and their faulty ways of behaving. So that's the disputation. It's helping to dispute the cognitions and attitudes and perceptions that the client has. With regard to decibels and countering interventions, this involves identifying and replacing or disputing thoughts that are linked to disturbing feelings. Oftentimes, our cognitions are related to our feelings. And it's the way we think about things, the way we feel about things that lead to the way we behave in certain situations. And so we already, the last lecture, we talked about the affect and the way a person thinks. The way in which a person feels. Affect focuses on the feelings. Cognitions focus on the way we think about issues, and then the behavior is the outcome. And so what's important to understand here is that a lot of this information or these interventions are very interconnected. When we talked about affective interventions and the way in which a person thinks, it's hard to talk about the way a person the way in which the person feels. You can't talk about the way a person feels without talking about their cognitions. And you can't talk about the way they think or their cognitions without looking at the behavior or the outcome. And so when we address cognitive interventions and we take into consideration decibels and countering interventions, what we want to do is identify, replace, or dispute those thoughts that are linked to disturbing feelings. Because as we said in our last lecture, most often than not, the clients that come into services, they come because they are bombarded with negative emotions. They are feeling sad, depressed, frustrated, irritated, and because of their affect and all of the negative affective issues, they come into us to resolve these issues. And the resolution of these issues are in order to help the client to feel better, to have more positive affect. We have to deal with some of the cognitions and the thinking and attitudes that impact the outcome. So just briefly, as a repeat, decibels and countering interventions is focused on identifying and replacing or disputing thoughts that are linked to disturbing feelings. As it relates to redecision work as a cognitive intervention, redecision work focuses on examining injunctions that the client received as a child. For example, they may have been taught as a child, you don't cry, boys don't feel, you have to be tough, You're a man. A man doesn't cry. Man up. Be strong. Be tough. And so redecision work examines injunctions that client received as a child. What are some of the messages that they received as a child? And you are helping the client to understand how some of the earlier messages that they received are impacting their decision making in the present. So just to restate redecision work, as a cognitive interventionist or a cognitive therapist, what you're doing with redecision work is helping the client to examine some of those earlier messages that they received as a child, and also helping them to make conscious decisions about whether they want to continue those messages, continue to allow those messages to resonate within them, or whether they want to let go of those messages and to come up with more practical, pro-social, affirmative messages to shape the outcome that they're wanting. And then we want to also use the cognitive intervention skill of cognitive restructuring. And with cognitive restructuring, we're helping the client to identify and replace negative self-statements with more positive, affirming self-statements. So, as you could see, redecision work and cognitive restructuring goes hand in hand. With redecision work, you first want to help the client to understand, where does the message come from? Who told you that as a man you're not supposed to cry, or you're not supposed to experience pain, or you're weak as a man if you cry or you express these intense emotions? And then the client may say, well, as a child growing up, my dad always said that strong men don't cry. You have to be tough. My grandfather also told me that I have to be tough, I have to be strong, never let anyone see me cry. And if I cry or if I express emotions, then I'm weak, and I never wanted to be perceived as weak. And so as the clinician, you help the client to understand that as humans, we experience a full gamut of emotions, and sometimes the emotion might be anger, but also we can express the emotion of sadness. And through expressing sadness, sometimes we cry, and that is a normal, healthy expression of emotion. And so with the cognitive restructuring, we're helping the client to explore the extent to which they want to either hold on to some of the faulty messages that they received in early life, or whether they want to let those messages go and then embrace more positive, pro-social kinds of thinking to have a more fulfilled lifestyle. And earlier with this lecture, I talked about schemas. And oftentimes when we do the redecision work and we understand some of the earlier messages that were received, some of the messages that were received in childhood, and then you understand the ways in which those earlier childhood messages play out in today's times, that in and of itself is where schemas come from. Schemas are rooted in early messages or early childhood experiences that live themselves out in our adult lives. And so what we do as cognitive interventionists, or we might be eclectic and we might borrow from the cognitive intervention frame of reference, is we help the client to understand the schemas, where they came from, and ways of restructuring the cognitive process so that it's more pro-social, more healthy, and more affirming. Thought stopping is another cognitive intervention skill. Oftentimes, clients are bombarded with negative thoughts. They might have in their heads, and it might be rooted in childhood experiences or messages that were conveyed that I'm stupid, I'm worthless, I'll never amount to anything. And so you might have a client that comes in and says, I'm really, even though I'm not worth much, I feel that I owe it to myself to try and get better. And as the clinician, you would want to find out, where did the message come from that you're worthless? What leads you to believe that you're a worthless individual? And you understand that maybe it was from earlier messages that were communicated either overtly or covertly. And the client may also have these recurrent thoughts that says, you know what, no matter how hard you try, you'll never achieve anything. After all, you're worthless. So they have these recurrent, unhealthy, negative thoughts that are recurrent in their heads, and it impacts their thinking and feeling, opinions about self as well as behavior. And so as cognitive interventionists, or those of us that might borrow from cognitive interventions, our role is to help the client in stopping negative thoughts and arriving at more productive, positive self-talk. And so thought stopping involves helping the client to develop ways of halting destructive or non-productive thoughts about self and others. So as you could see, it's not just about oneself that you might have these negative thoughts. It might be of someone else. It might be of the example we talked about of the co-workers. And so you have this client with the negative thoughts associated with the co-workers, and so you have to assist the client in stopping the negative thoughts associated with the co-workers. So when it comes to thought stopping, it's not only as it relates to the individual. Sometimes it might be assisting the client in stopping the negative self-talk or thoughts associated with a coworker. And so when we look at positive self-talk, that's one of the ways in which we overcome thought stopping. And so what is positive self-talk? Well, just as a brief definition, positive self-talk involves showing the client ways to replace his or her negative self-talk with positive self-talk. And so when you help the client to identify positive self-talk, it helps to build their confidence. And so let's look at a particular example about a way in which you can help a client to establish positive self-talk, not only with self but with others. And so let's go back to the example that we talked about with regard to the client who received all these negative childhood messages about maybe being worthless, that they'll never amount to anything, that it's a waste of effort and time to ever try. And so as the clinician, you would say to the client, whenever that message comes into your mind, you tell in your head, you say, stop it. In your head, you have a voice that is telling the negative self-talk, stop it. You are worthwhile. You are meaningful. You do have the potential and capability to achieve the goals that you set for yourself. Just keep putting one foot in front of the other. Keep making strides forward. We're not looking back. We're looking forward. So as the clinician, you could help the client to identify positive self-statements, affirming self-statements that they are able to say to themselves when they want to counter the negative self-talk. And so what I oftentimes do as a clinician is I get the client to write down positive statements or positive affirming statements that they would say to themselves, because it's always important for the client to use their words to arrive at positive self-talk messages that are consistent with what they would likely say to themselves. And then what I also do in looking at the list that they have come up with, I might provide the client with additional messages based upon my observations. So one of my observations is that you are a worthwhile individual. You're smart, you're intelligent. The fact that you decided to come in for services speaks to your level of intelligence and fortitude. You can do it. I have seen positive strides that you've made thus far, and you're making progress. And so, as the clinician, not only do you provide an opportunity for the client to develop positive self-talk, you also, as the clinician, affirm the client by giving them positive self-messages. And so the other example we talked about is when the client has negative perceptions about the coworker, and with some positive self-talk messages that would be relevant to what the client would say to the coworkers. And so, for example, you might assist the client in coming up with a list of positive self-talk. Maybe the client might say, you know what, I'm internalizing. They don't necessarily feel that way. They might be having a bad day. It's okay if I approach them with a positive attitude. My positive attitude will be greeted with positive affirmation. And so again, as the clinician, not only do you allow the client to develop this list of positive messages to use as self-talk, but what you also want to do is to assist the client in developing messages. So as the clinician, I might help the client to arrive at messages that might say that perhaps they're having a bad day. If you're positive, they will receive you positively. When they greet you negatively, greet them with a smile. Be kind, be patient. Find pro-social ways of interacting with them. So again, in this situation, you're helping them to stop the negative thoughts by arriving at positive self-talk. And just to use myself as an example, there are times I might interact with, sometimes it's a complete stranger, sometimes it's a colleague, and I might interact with the person, and it may not evolve the way in which I'd like for it to. Maybe I might say hello with a positive, warm greeting, and it may not be reciprocated. Perhaps the person will speak, sometimes they may not speak. But what I have learned to do with positive self-talk and thought stopping is to say to myself, it's not about me. Perhaps the person is going through something. What my responsibility to do as a colleague is to be positive and warm and engaging. And if persons don't receive me the way in which my energy is intended, it's not my problem, it's someone else's. And so to diffuse the negative energy and to diffuse the internalizing of situations and to stop the negative self-talk. I'm sure all of us could think back to situations and instances in our own lives where we have to counteract the negative self-talk with the positive self-talk. We have to work on thought stopping and affirmation and affirming statements. So everything that we are talking about, not only is it relevant to our clients, it's also relevant to us as individuals as well. Anchoring is an additional cognitive intervention. And anchoring espouses that we help the client to replace unsupportive reactions to situations with positive or supportive responses to those situations. So if a person approaches us in a negative way or with a negative energy or spirit, anchoring suggests that we encourage our client to replace unpleasant, unsupportive reactions to situations with more positive ones. So when the one client confronts the co-workers who's negative, who may not be pleasant, warm, or engaging, the client still has a responsibility to put out positive energy. They still have the responsibility to be pleasant, affirming, personable, and engaging. And so anchoring suggests that you do not let external forces dictate the way in which you respond to others, that irrespective of how your external world respond toward you, that you as the individual or you as the client will replace unsupportive reactions to situations with positive, supportive, affirming responses. And oftentimes, positive energy will receive positive energy. And there are instances where it doesn't happen, but by and large, human nature will receive positive energy in a positive way. Reframing is another cognitive intervention skill that is very important, and reframing involves helping the client to recognize more constructive or realistic interpretations to events that he or she formerly interpreted negatively. And it kind of goes back to what I said already, where the client might perceive the co-workers as being rude or negative, or that they hate him and wishes that he wasn't there. And so with reframing, you might say to the client, tell me what other assumptions you can arrive at as it relates to your colleague's behavior. And so you just allow them to brainstorm a host of other issues that could be going on, rather than the fact that the co-workers hate him. And so once the client has brainstormed, or they might say, you know what, I have no other ideas. I can't figure anything else out. And you might say to the client, is it possible that maybe the co-worker or co-workers are having problems that have nothing to do with you? They might be having issues in their home life. They might be having struggles on the job that they may have no idea about. And so with reframing, sometimes clients have insight and they're able to think broad and objectively and come up with other reasons to explain what they're experiencing. And there are times that we as clinicians might have to give additional information to help the client arrive at suggestions to help them reframe what they believe to be a reality. Because oftentimes when we arrive at assumptions with regard to behavior, it's not what it appears to be. There's a difference between one's subjective reality and one's objective reality. And if we do nothing else but help the client to explore alternatives to their assumptions that they make about certain antecedent or experiences, I think we've done a great job. Because oftentimes when a client can explore things from different positions and different perspectives in order to understand what they're experiencing, they're closer to not internalizing negativity or negative energy, or in terms of owning some negative perceptions about something that is happening around them. Symptom prescription is another important cognitive intervention skill, and symptom prescription involves confronting the client's apparent lack of control over problems by having the client to initiate the problem. And so it's important to help the client to understand that there are times in which they have no control over what is happening around them. Sometimes this example suggests that it's important that they give in to the issues that they think exist around them. So the symptom prescription is saying that, okay, if you believe that your co-workers hate you, so what do you want to do with that? So let's say they hate you. And what's the worst thing that could happen as it relates to your coworkers hating you and wanting you to be gone from the environment? Let's say they do hate you. So what about it? Does that mean that you're not a worthwhile individual? Does it mean that you should quit your job? Does it mean that they should control the way in which you feel? So sometimes what we have to do is to prescribe the symptom. We have to allow the client to believe that, what if your coworkers do hate you? Sometimes you have to allow them to believe the worst and unpack and explore what does it mean if what they perceive is actual or factual. And to understand that even if what they are perceiving is actual, the co-workers really do in fact hate them, don't view them as a important person, would rather them be fired from the job. So what of it? What do you do with that? How do you live with that? And so what the symptom prescription does is it helps the client to realize that they are in control of their destiny. They are in control of their cognitions. They're in control of their affect as well as their behavior. And they don't have to give the control to someone else. And also the fact that it can be okay in spite of the fact that, in the example I've talked about before, that the co-workers hate them and wish that they were gone. That can have little impact or bearing on their psyche, on their cognitions, on their affect, and on the way in which they behave. They are taking the control rather than giving the control of their affect, cognitions, and behavior to someone else. And symptom prescription espouses just that, allowing the client to confront their apparent lack of control over problems by allowing the client to just sit with the problem, to initiate the problem, and to embrace the problem. Resisting therapeutic change. There are times when we have to suggest to the client that change may not happen readily, or it may not be lasting. So in the client where they're having problems with the co-workers, even when you allow the client or you assist the client in reframing their thinking, behaving differently with their co-workers, even when all of those suggestions have been tried, you've done role plays, the client has been effective with the role plays, and they go and they try and implement it, but yet it doesn't impact their reality. It's important to understand that it's okay. Change takes time. Acceptance is what's most important. And so resisting therapeutic change is suggesting to the client that change may not happen. And even if change doesn't happen readily, they're okay. And even if they see small bits of change, it may not last long. But still, in that situation, it is okay to embrace the situation as it is and to find internal acceptance. So, in a nutshell, that involves all of the 16 skills as well as cognitive interventions related to cognitive intervention therapy. We will continue by talking about behavioral interventions.